So I think we know that many people need to check their blood pressure on a regular and, quite frankly, daily basis, and don't necessarily find it easy to do. And many of the blood pressure readings are faulty. And so that being the case, the idea of cuffless blood pressure measurement is obviously very attractive. It's not a new idea. It's been around for a while. There have been many efforts to try to make it happen. So far, we don't have cuffless blood pressure meters that can be used by people at home. And so, that being the case, Rockley Photonics' latest paper, which they've released in August, which talks about the results from the recent trials of their Alpha 1 device, is interesting. And so that's what we're going to talk about in this video. The paper itself is quite insightful. It raises some interesting issues, some implicitly, some explicitly. We're going to explore both. And of course, it shares the results. And so we will review the results, we will review the paper, we will discuss the issues, and draw some conclusions. So, hi folks, welcome back to the channel. Hope everybody is happy and healthy and have the time to get out there and exercise. Before we dive in, a few important disclosures. I have no relationship with Rockley Photonics. I'm not getting paid for doing this video. They don't get to review it or have any say in it. You get to see it first, so enjoy. And so with that, let's dive into the paper. And one of the things that they talk about in the paper very explicitly is that there are no explicit published FDA, Federal Drug Administration, which is the agency in the US that approves or clears medical devices and drugs. There are no published FDA standards for either testing or validating or approving cuffless blood pressure devices. And that is quite correct. They also talk about the paper about two standards by standards organizations. One is the ISO 81060. The other one is IEEE 1708, which talk about testing of blood pressure devices. Neither standard, of course, is an FDA standard. Neither standard is binding on the FDA. And so there is some uncertainty there. However, and this is something that they don't talk about in the Rockley Photonics paper, but that we need to be aware of, the FDA has cleared 4 cuffless blood pressure measuring devices. Now, that doesn't establish a standard per se that the FDA needs to follow in the future, but it does offer some clues. And furthermore, it is quite possible that one or multiple of those devices could be used as a reference device going forward when testing, for instance, Rockley Photonics device to see how well it performs. Now, in terms of testing blood pressure devices in general, there are 2 fundamental ways of doing it. The traditional gold standard is what is called the A line. It's an arterial line that is inserted using an arterial catheter and also uses a transducer, which converts the blood pressure, into electric signals. The problem with the A line, and in terms of using it for testing things like cuffless blood pressure devices, is that it's invasive. You basically need to insert a catheter, which is not an easy or pleasant thing to do necessarily. And it's certainly not suited once you've catheterized someone and inserted the line and connected them to the device for measuring blood pressure of people who are moving around, whether it's walking or running, bicycling, or just going about their lives. And so from that perspective, the A-line is not particularly useful in this case. In reality, A-lines are predominantly used in ICUs, intensive care units, for a few days at a time. They're not used continuously over extended period of times beyond that. Though the good thing about them is that they do measure blood pressure continuously. which is of course something that cuffed blood pressure devices or blood pressure cuffs do not do. And so that of course leads us directly to the other method of measuring blood pressure, which we're most familiar with, and that is blood pressure cuffs. The problem with blood pressure cuffs, again, as a reference device, is that they do not measure blood pressure continuously, right? They have to be inflated, deflated, and you have to leave a little time in between. And secondly, they're not particularly useful or suitable for measuring blood pressure when people are moving around. Once again, walking, cycling, running, going about their lives. And so both methods, quite frankly, pose challenges in terms of validating a continuous cuffless blood pressure device. There are some things that Rockley did here that we're going to talk about that introduces some level of effort and some level of exertion, but still, it's not that easy because more or less you need to have someone sitting. Maybe they could be on a treadmill if you want, if they had an A-line connected to them, that I'm not sure they would love doing that. Same thing maybe with a stationary bike, but it gets a little bit complicated, obviously. So clearly, if we're going to test continuous cuffless blood pressure meters and validate them, something like this will probably need to happen to a lesser or greater extent. So a conversation to be continued. Now, one thing that is important to understand, both when we talk about A-lines and blood pressure cuffs, is that they both use what I refer to as transducers. And the transducers convert physical pressure, which in this case is blood pressure, of course, into electric signals. And that's how we know how much pressure there is. The big difference between both the A-line and blood pressure cuffs and cuffless blood pressure meters is that cuffless blood pressure meters do not measure blood pressure directly. There is no way here of connecting a transducer or anything like that, because cuffless measures blood pressure indirectly. It estimates it, so it doesn't actually really measure it. Rather, it uses various methods, as I said, to estimate it, and those methods are all derivative of heart rate measurements. So we have methods such as pulse arrival time and pulse transit time, and we'll look at pulse wave analysis. And sometimes we combine those methods. But once again, the important thing to understand about them is that they are estimation methods. They estimate blood pressure, they don't measure it directly, which of course means that there are some assumptions that we have to make, and the lack of direct measurement, of course, always introduces some inaccuracies. So that's something we need to be aware of when we talk about cuffless blood pressure measurement and validation of cuffless blood pressure measurement devices. So with that background out of the way, let's talk about what Rockley Photonics did. And they did three things. First, they built a new device for cufflessly measuring blood pressure. They call it the Alpha 1 device. And we will talk in more detail about what it is and what it does in just a second. And secondly, they conducted two clinical studies with healthy volunteers. The first one is an A-line study. And so they catheterized some 30 volunteers and connected A-lines and transducer-based blood pressure devices to them. And secondly, they conducted a validation study where they used the Alpha 1 and compared it to a blood pressure cuff. Now, the purpose of the A-line study was really to generate data for the algorithm development. And then in the validation study, they used the algorithm which they implemented on Alpha 1 on the device and compared it to the values obtained from a blood pressure cuff from the opposite arm to see how reliable the measurements from the Alpha 1 device are. And that is what the paper is predominantly about. And so now let's get back and talk a little bit about the Alpha 1 device before we talk about the results. So one interesting feature of this device is that it has two containers of sensors. It has one container which is sort of the dorsal, top of the wrist, which sort of where you would put a watch, and it looks a little bit like a watch. And then it has one on the side of the wristband, which is called sort of the radial location, which has exactly the same sensors. And the radial one is really looking to measure blood pressure in the radial artery, which goes from the elbow to the thumb, and does it sort of depending on the person a little bit to the side potentially. Now it may seem strange that they have two sets of devices here, but it actually makes sense. There is some good logic to it. The first one is that the top of the wrist dorsal location, as those of you who've seen my videos will know, is really not the best of locations to measure much of anything, quite frankly. It's a great location for a screen, but that's about it. And secondly, it gives them the opportunity, quite frankly, to compare data from one set of sensors with the data from the second set of sensors, and that's kind of clever. Now, in terms of the sensors that both of these containers house, so there is a laser sensor in each, and each also has 3 LED sensors, sort of red, green, and near infrared, which is the kind of sensors that you normally find on smartwatches. And it also has 2 photodiodes, and the diodes is sort of what captures the light that is reflected from either the laser or the LEDs. Now, interestingly enough, in this paper, they only report the data and the results of the radial laser sensor. They do not report any data from the dorsal sensors, and they also do not report any data from the radial LEDs. And it's interesting because I think it points to some potential conclusions here, right? One is that the data from the laser is more accurate than the data from the LEDs, which is not in the least surprising, because the laser light, as we know, is much better focused and therefore renders much better signals. And secondly, which once again is not surprising, that the data from the radial location is most likely better than the data from the dorsal top of the wrist location. And in fact, they give us a hint of that in one of the graphs that they show here, where they compare some of the data that they captured in the A-line study. And they show us sort of the waveform generated by the radial laser, and they also show us the waveform generated by the radial green LED light. And no surprises here. The waveform generated by the laser is much, much sharper, much better defined, and much more useful than that generated by the green LED. All right, so now what we know what the Alpha device is like and what it does, let's talk about the 2 studies that they conducted. And so the first study they conducted was the A-line study. 30 healthy volunteers with a fairly restrictive set of inclusion and exclusion criteria. They're listed in the paper, and I'm going to post the paper in the description below, so if you want to look at it, it's going to be there. But the important thing to understand here is that they used the data from the A-line study to develop the algorithm. And what they ended up with is a rigid regression linear model, which may mean something to some of you. If it doesn't, don't worry about it. It's a model that you use to sort of not overfit the data, especially when you suspect or know that there is a multicollinearity and things like this and potential for it. So linear regression model, just think about that. And then they conducted the second study, the longitudinal study, which lasted 30 days, had 6 visits parceled out over those 30 days, and had 37 volunteers in it, once again, healthy volunteers. And there were 2 variations to it. There was sort of sitting, and they also at times had them press a leg press while in a seated position, just to get them to exert themselves a little bit and see if that would raise their blood pressure and obviously give them a little bit more data. Now, for the second study, what they were doing is that they were capturing data with both the alpha-1 and with the blood pressure cuff, and obviously are comparing those two to see how reliable the hardware and the algorithm of the alpha-1 is compared to the blood pressure cuffs, and that's what we're going to talk about next. So what do the results that they share with us in the paper show? Well, the alpha-1 is promising, but it's certainly not good enough to be released in the wild yet. If we look at the left panel, it shows a graph where the reference on the horizontal axis is the blood pressure cuff, and the vertical values are from the alpha-1. And ideally, all the data points would be on the 45-degree line, but they're not. They're scattered, and that tells us clearly that although they don't give us a correlation number, which I quite frankly think they should, the correlation is certainly less than 1. And that is quite frankly confirmed if we look at the top right-hand panel, where 78% of the dystolic and 72% of the systolic values fall within 10 milligram mercury of the values generated by the blood pressure cuff. And so they got 78% of the dystolic and 72% of the systolic values right with the alpha-1. It becomes significantly less reliable if you look at the data that they got when people were doing the sitting leg press. Now we're down to 66% of the values for dystolic and 58% for the systolic, falling within 10 millimeter of mercury when you compare alpha-1 to a blood pressure cuff. And, that leaves significant room for improvement, which is, quite frankly, to their credit, also their conclusion from this study. So a good start, but clearly more work to be done here. And so recognizing this, what do they say that they're going to do in the paper? Well, first, they're going to develop a better piece of hardware. They're going to go back and develop an alpha-2 device. And they say they're going to focus on 2 things in particular. One is the ease of placement, and so clearly they decided that the placement of the sensors were not optimal, not ideal. And secondly, they're going to work on the laser signal stability, which first of all suggests to me that they're favoring the laser over the LEDs, which makes a lot of sense. As we've talked before, lasers are much more precise in their signals. And second, I guess there must be having some issues in terms of being able to generate the laser signal in a reliable manner, in a continuous fashion. They're also planning on engaging with the FDA to hopefully get some guidance in terms of what kind of trials they should be conducting. And finally, they're going to collect much larger and more diverse data sets to train the algorithm. And once again, if they want to develop a device that can be used 24/7 or at least for multiple hours in a continuous manner, they obviously need to train it on a much wider range of data with people engaging in a variety of different activities so that the algorithm recognizes the data, which it really didn't do in this study. If you look at some of the panels, it is very clear that some of the data definitely fell out outside of the ranges that the algorithm recognized. And so what should we conclude from this study? Well, a few things. Laser is more reliable than LEDs. I think we already knew that. Their study seems to confirm that, at least implicitly, because they don't share any of the LED data. And they talk about improving the laser signal, which I think gives a hint that that's probably what they're looking to go with, the laser. Secondly, the radial side position of sensors is something that they're favoring. I think if they got better data from the dorsal top of the wrist, they would be using that for the paper and the analysis. And once again, no surprises there. I've talked about it on many occasions that I really don't believe that the top of the wrist is a good place to be gathering vital signs, because there are not many vital signs to be gathered there. Always better to have more data, and data from more diverse populations, of course, and data from people moving about if you're going to produce a device that people are expected to be wearing throughout the days or even 24/7. And so the fact that they recognize that they need to gather more data is good, and hopefully something that they're going to do. Now for the big question. What does this mean in terms of when they may have a device that is reliable enough? Well, my sense is that between tweaking the device to come up with the Alpha 2, talking to the FDA, designing some trials, and then conducting those trials with larger and more diverse populations with a wider range of activities, we are probably talking about sort of a year's worth of activities. And so if they're going to spend the next 12 months doing this, and then hopefully they have data that they can submit to the FDA to get something cleared, then my sense is, under the best of circumstances, if things go well, they should maybe or will maybe have something that is marketable 18 months from now. So that is sort of my bet, and we'll see how it plays out. Right, so thanks for watching. That's really all I had to say about this study, which I've posted in the description below. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you found it useful. Be well, and we'll talk to you soon. Take good care. Bye-bye.